The night Rebecca Grady arrived at the Donnelly homestead, the sky split open with lightning, and the whole of Calhoun County, Texas, watched her step off the wagon like she owned every mile of soaked red earth beneath her boots. It was the spring of 1878, and the land was wild in ways that maps never quite captured. The grass on the open range came up to a horse's belly after a wet march, and the mesquite trees twisted themselves into shapes that looked, at certain angles, like men frozen mid-reach. Rebecca had come west from Nashville, Tennessee, answering an advertisement placed in the Nashville Banner by a man she had never met, a man whose handwriting was neat and careful and whose words on the page were sparse and practical, the kind of writing that told you a person measured everything before committing it to paper. She had the advertisement folded in her coat pocket even now, though the rain had softened the paper and the ink had begun to blur at the edges. She did not need to read it. She had memorized it the moment she'd answered it 3 months before, when her situation in Nashville had grown untenable enough that a leap into the unknown seemed more rational than staying put. Rancher, 31 years, honest means, no debts, no dependents, seeks capable woman of good character for companionship and partnership in building a life on working cattle land, Calhoun County, Texas. Respond to I. Donnelly, Box 14, Indianola Post. That was it. No flourishes. No false promises about love or adventure. Just the plain shape of a man's need, written out with the kind of economy that Rebecca had found, upon reflection, more honest than any dozen flowery letters she'd received from men who wanted only her face and her willingness to obey. She had written back. He had written back. They had exchanged 4 letters in total, each one brief and transactional, discussing practical matters: what she could cook, what she could not, whether she could ride, whether she feared hard work, whether she expected luxury. She had answered all of it honestly, and he had answered her questions with the same plain candor, and by the end of their correspondence she felt she knew the rough dimensions of the man even if she could not yet see his face. Now she was seeing his face, and it was not what she'd imagined. Isaac Donnelly was standing under the overhang of the porch when the wagon rolled in, and the first thing Rebecca noticed was that he was taller than she'd pictured, broad through the shoulders in a way that came from real labor and not posture, with dark hair plastered flat by the rain he'd walked through to meet her at the edge of the yard. His jaw was set with the particular tension of a man who had prepared himself for something difficult, and his eyes, dark brown and deep-set beneath straight dark brows, moved over her with an expression she could not read. He was not unkind-looking. He was not handsome in the theatrical sense. He was the kind of face that the land made over time, when it weathered a person honestly rather than cruelly. There were lines at the corners of his eyes and a scar along his left jaw that caught the lamplight from the house behind him, and his hands when he reached up to help her down from the wagon were rough, calloused, and sure. "Miss Grady," he said, just that, just her name. "Mr. Donnelly," she replied. They looked at each other for a moment that stretched longer than either of them expected, the rain coming down around the porch overhang in a steady curtain, and then he picked up her 2 bags without being asked and carried them inside. The house was better than she'd feared and less comfortable than she'd hoped, which she supposed was honest enough for a beginning. The main room served as sitting area, kitchen, and dining space all at once, with a stone fireplace that drew well and a table of solid pine that could seat 6. There were 2 rooms beyond, one clearly his and one clearly meant to be hers, and between them a narrow hallway that someone had swept recently and with care. A woman from the neighboring property, Mrs. Adeline Holt, a rounder woman of 50 with quick eyes and a kindly mouth, had apparently come over to make the house presentable. She was still there when Rebecca arrived, and she bustled forward with the warmth of someone who had been waiting all afternoon to exercise it. "Honey, welcome, welcome," Adeline said, taking Rebecca's damp coat and hanging it near the fire. "You must be frozen clean through. Come sit, I've got beans on and cornbread in the oven, and we'll get you sorted out in no time." Rebecca thanked her genuinely, because the warmth of the fire and the smell of real food cooking made her throat tighten with relief in a way she hadn't anticipated. She had held herself together for 3 months, through the packing and the departure and the long rattling journey by rail and then by stage and then finally by wagon. And now that she was actually here, actually standing in the place she had chosen, the weight of it landed on her all at once. She did not cry. She simply sat down at the pine table when Adeline pointed to a chair, and she folded her hands in her lap and she breathed. Isaac stood near the door for a moment, watching her in that same unreadable way, and then he removed his wet coat and hat, hung them on the peg by the door, and went to the fire to add a log. They ate supper together that first night with Adeline present as a buffer, and conversation flowed between the women easily enough, because Adeline had the gift of filling silence with warmth rather than noise. She told Rebecca about the county, the neighbors, the rhythms of the seasons, where the nearest town was, what they called the dry creek to the south and why they called it that. Rebecca asked questions and listened carefully, filing everything away. Isaac ate and said nothing beyond passing the bread when asked. Rebecca noticed it but did not remark on it. Men were quiet sometimes. Men who lived alone on working cattle land were often quiet. She had not come here expecting a man who would talk her ear off across the supper table. She had come here expecting partnership, and she understood that partnership was built over time. Adeline left near 9 o'clock, patting Rebecca's hand and telling her to send word if she needed anything at all, and then it was just the two of them in the fire-lit room. Isaac stoked the fire and said good night without looking at her fully, and Rebecca heard his bedroom door close with a quiet, deliberate click. She sat alone at the table for a little while, listening to the rain ease off into a soft drumming, and then she went to bed in her own room and lay awake watching the shadows on the ceiling and thinking about the fact that she had crossed 500 miles of country to be in this house. And she felt neither regret nor certainty. Only the particular sharp aliveness that comes from standing at the true beginning of something. The days that followed had a structure to them that emerged almost immediately, the way water finds the low ground. Rebecca rose early and cooked breakfast, because she was a woman who could not be idle in a house, and cooking was the most practical use of early morning energy. Isaac was always already up when she emerged, already outdoors or in the barn, and he came in for breakfast without ceremony and ate with the focused quiet of a man who treated meals as fuel more than pleasure. They worked in parallel across those first days, learning the shape of each other's routines without needing to discuss them. Rebecca discovered the garden behind the house that had been left untended through the winter and began the work of turning it over, a task that consumed her arms and back and satisfied her in a deep physical way. She found the root cellar and inventoried what was there. She mended 3 shirts she found in a basket in the corner of the main room, shirts with small tears that a man living alone simply had not gotten around to fixing. When she presented the mended shirts to Isaac on the 3rd morning, folded neatly on the table beside his breakfast plate, something shifted briefly in his expression, a small easing around the eyes, and he said, "Thank you, Miss Grady," in a voice that was lower and quieter than she expected, as if the words had come from somewhere that didn't usually produce words. "Rebecca," she said, "if you don't mind, Miss Grady makes me feel like I'm standing in a schoolroom." He looked at her then, a direct look that lasted just long enough to feel deliberate. "Rebecca," he repeated, as if testing the weight of it. And then he took his coffee and his plate and ate at the table while she ate across from him, and they were quiet together in a way that was not entirely uncomfortable. The supper problem began on the 2nd night, after Adeline had gone, and they were no longer cushioned by her cheerful presence. Supper was different from breakfast. Breakfast had the excuse of the coming day's work pressing in on both of them, the legitimate urgency of tasks waiting. Supper was the day ending, the particular quiet that came down over the land at dusk when the cattle settled, and the birds quieted and the air cooled off from its afternoon heat, and there was no urgency at all. There was only the table and the lamp and two people who were legally bound together by an arrangement and by nothing else yet. Rebecca had made a good supper that second night. Pork chops and biscuits and early greens from the garden, with dried apple preserves she'd found in the root cellar. She set it out with care, not because she was performing anything, but because she had been raised to believe that a table set with intention was a kind of hospitality even in a household of two. Isaac sat down when she called him and bowed his head for a moment in what she understood was a private grace, and then he ate. He did not speak, not a word. Not a comment on the food, which was good. She knew it was good. Not a question about her day or a remark about the weather, which had cleared to something spectacular and golden. Not a word. Rebecca ate her own supper and told herself this was simply how some men were, and that she should not read into it, and that it was early days, and that she was, by any reasonable measure, a stranger to him. But the third night came, and again the silence descended over the supper table like a physical thing, a weight that settled into the gaps between them and pressed outward against the edges of the room. The fourth night it sat there again. Rebecca had made a beef stew with the last of the winter's dried herbs and fresh bread, and she had, without quite deciding to, put a small jar of wildflowers she'd found growing near the creek at the center of the table. Yellow ones, bright as a shout. Isaac had looked at them when he sat down, a quick flicker of his gaze, and then he had looked at his bowl, and he had eaten in total silence. The fifth night Rebecca tried. She asked about the south pasture fence she'd seen him working on. He answered with 3 words, "Coming along fine." She asked about the calf she'd seen him doctoring near the barn. "Should be all right." She mentioned that she'd written a letter to her cousin Clara back in Nashville, and that Clara had recently had a baby. He nodded, which was not, technically, a word. She stopped trying and finished her supper in silence and cleared the table without a word, and she did not feel angry exactly, but she felt something, a low, persistent ache, the kind that comes not from one sharp thing but from many small ones. The sixth night the silence was so complete and so established that it had taken on a quality of its own, like weather. Rebecca set the table and called him in and served the food and sat down and watched him across the pine planks of that table and thought very carefully about what she was doing here and whether she had made a terrible mistake. She had not come expecting love, she reminded herself. She had come expecting partnership. But partnership required exchange, and exchange required words, and this man seemed to have sealed himself behind something she could not name or reach, and she was beginning to feel less like a partner and more like a piece of furniture that happened to cook his meals. She was 26 years old, and she had already lived through things that had taken the softness out of her and replaced it with something more durable. But she was not without feeling, and the feeling she had now, at the end of the sixth silent supper, was something close to loneliness, and loneliness in a house with another person in it was a particular kind of difficult. That night she sat by the fire after Isaac went to bed, and she wrote in the journal she kept in her room, writing out the shape of her days with the care of someone who needed to understand her own life clearly. She wrote about the garden and the cattle and the county and the color of the sky at sunset and the way the coyotes called to each other from the far hills after dark. She wrote about Adeline, who had come by twice more and brought preserves and news in her easy warmth. She wrote about Isaac, not bitterly but honestly, the way you write about a problem you are trying to solve. She wrote, "He works hard. He is not unkind. He does not speak at supper. I do not know why. I have not yet asked the right question." She looked at that last line for a long time. Then she closed the journal and banked the fire and went to bed. On the 7th night she made the best supper she had made since arriving. She slaughtered a chicken, which she did quickly and without ceremony because she had grown up on a farm in Tennessee, and she was not sentimental about chickens. She roasted it with wild onions and the dried sage she'd found in the garden's neglected herb bed, and she made proper gravy and boiled cornmeal pudding with the last of the good molasses, and she set the table with the good cloth she'd brought from Nashville. the one her mother had embroidered with small blue flowers at the corners. She put more wildflowers in the jar. When Isaac came in from the evening chores and washed up at the basin by the door, he paused for just a moment when he saw the table, the cloth and the flowers and the roasted chicken golden in its pan. Something passed through his face that was gone before she could catalog it. He sat down. He bowed his head. He reached for his fork. Rebecca poured the coffee and sat across from him and waited until he had eaten a few bites, until the food had done its preliminary work of settling a man, and then she set down her own fork and she looked at him directly across the width of the table. "Isaac," she said, "what happened to you?" He went very still. Not startled still, not the stillness of a man surprised, but the stillness of a man who had been waiting without knowing it, for exactly that question to arrive. The lamp between them threw warm light up across his face, and in that light she could see the working of something in him, in the set of his jaw and the depth of his eyes and the way his hands, those big calloused hands, closed slowly around his coffee cup. "What do you mean?" he said. His voice was rough, as if the vocal cords needed warming up. "I mean," Rebecca said steadily, "that you are not a man who has nothing to say. I can see that. You watch everything, you think about things. And every night you sit down at this table and you eat what I've made and you don't say a single word and you go to bed. And I have been telling myself it's just how you are. But it isn't just how you are, is it? Something happened. And I am not asking to pry. I am asking because I came here to be your partner, and I cannot be your partner if I don't know who you are." The silence after she spoke was different from all the previous silences. It was the silence of something balanced on a fulcrum. Isaac looked at her for a long moment, and she held his gaze and did not look away, and did not soften the question with a smile or a word of apology. She had meant it, and she let him see that she had meant it. He set down his coffee cup. He looked at the tablecloth, at the embroidered flowers her mother had stitched. He looked back up at her, and then he began to talk. He talked about his first wife, whose name was Miriam. He said it plainly, without theatrics, as if the name were a stone he had been carrying in his chest and had just set on the table between them. He and Miriam had married in 1873, when he was 26 and she was 24, and they had come to Calhoun County together from Ohio with everything they owned in a wagon, and the kind of hope that young people carry before the land teaches them its real terms. Miriam had been a laughing woman. That was the word Isaac used. Laughing. He said it with a quality in his voice that made Rebecca's chest hurt, the particular ache of listening to someone describe something beautiful that is gone. She had laughed at everything, he said, at the coyotes and the prairie dogs and the spectacular sunsets and even the hardships, because she had the gift of finding the comic in the difficult, which was, he said quietly, the most useful thing a person could have out here. They had built the house together. Not the building itself, he had hired help for that, but the making of it into a home, the small decisions and the shared labor, the garden and the root cellar and the particular placement of the table, so that you could see the hills through the south window at the same time you could see the fire. All of that had been Miriam's. In the spring of 1875, Miriam had become pregnant with their first child. Rebecca watched Isaac's hands tighten on the coffee cup. It had not gone well. He did not go into the details with the cold, clinical distance of a man who had buried the feeling, but with the careful precision of a man who was choosing which details to give voice to, because some things could be described and some could not. There had been complications. There had been a doctor in Indianola who was a good enough doctor for most things but not good enough for this thing. And by the time the night was over, Miriam was gone and so was the child. And Isaac was alone in the house he had built with her hands in hers, with the table in the exact position she had chosen so you could see the hills and the fire at once. He had kept the table where she'd put it. Rebecca looked at the table. She looked at the window. The hills were dark shapes against the night sky, visible even now. He had managed, he said. That was the word he used. Managed. He had kept the cattle and the land and the house because they were real and they required tending, and they did not let a man sink into himself entirely, which was perhaps what they were for. He had worked from before dawn until after dark for 3 years, and he had been, in that working, something that was not quite alive and not quite otherwise, suspended in the amber of grief and labor. It was his neighbor Thomas Holt, Adeline's husband, who had eventually sat down with him one evening and said, quietly and without judgment, that a man needed more than work and land, that the house needed life in it. That Isaac was not 50 years old and he was not finished. Thomas had said these things with the simplicity of genuine friendship, and Isaac had listened in the way that a person listens when they already know the truth of something but need someone else to say it before they can accept it. So he had placed the advertisement. He had written it 6 times before arriving at the version Rebecca had read, because he did not know how to ask for what he needed without making it sound like he was asking for a replacement for something irreplaceable. He had settled on practicality because practicality was honest, and because he no longer trusted himself to offer anything else. And then her letter had come. Isaac paused here and looked at her, and the quality of that look was something Rebecca had not seen on his face before. It was open, in the way that faces are open when the careful structures a person has built around themselves have been taken down, deliberately with effort, in the presence of someone they have decided, even if tentatively, to trust. "Your letters were honest," he said, "every one of them. I read them several times because I was trying to find the part where you were telling me what you thought I wanted to hear and there wasn't one." "I didn't see the point," Rebecca said. "No," he said. "I know that." "I could tell." She asked him then, because she was a woman who believed in asking things directly when the moment permitted it, why the silence at supper? Why had he gone quiet at that particular table, at that particular hour? He was quiet for a moment, not the heavy sealed quiet of the previous 6 nights, but a thoughtful quiet, a man finding the right words for something he had not put into words before. Supper was hers, he said. She used to talk all through supper. Everything she'd seen that day, everything she'd thought about, questions she had about the land or the cattle or something she'd read in the paper when it came. She made supper into something. And when she was gone, I kept eating at the table because it was the table and I didn't know where else to put myself, but I couldn't talk. I just couldn't. There was nobody to talk to, and even when there was, the talking felt like something that belonged to a time that wasn't anymore. He stopped. He looked at his hands. "And then you came," he said. "And you set the table and you cooked real food and you put flowers in a jar and you sat across from me and I didn't know how to start. Every night I sat down and I thought, tonight I will say something. And then the silence was already there and it seemed like it had more weight than I did." Rebecca looked at him for a long time. The fire had settled into a low, steady glow, and the lamp between them burned clean and bright, and outside the night sounds of the Texas spring came through the cracked window, the frogs and the nighthawks and the distant murmur of wind in the tall grass. "Tell me about Ohio," she said. He looked at her with something in his face that was very close to surprise. "Ohio," he repeated. "You came from Ohio. You haven't told me a single thing about where you're from or what your life was before you came here." "Tell me about Ohio," and he told her. He talked about Ohio the way a man talks about a childhood place when he is far enough from it that the hard parts have gone soft, and the good parts come back in specific detail. He had grown up on a farm outside of Zanesville, the second of 4 children, with a father who was a decent farmer and a difficult man, and a mother who was a magnificent woman who had died too young. A refrain, Rebecca thought, that seemed to follow the women in Isaac Donnelly's life. His older brother Daniel had stayed in Ohio and taken over the farm. His 2 younger sisters, Harriet and Jane, had married men in the county and were still there, and he wrote to them sometimes and they wrote back, and the letters were full of nieces and nephews he had never met. He talked about learning to read from his mother, who had believed fiercely in it, who had drilled him on his letters at the kitchen table while the bread baked, and about discovering that he liked numbers, that there was a satisfaction in accounts that balanced and distances that could be calculated and problems that had, if you worked them correctly, a precise and answerable answer. He talked about the decision to come west. It had not been grief or desperation that drove it. Not then. It had been something more like ambition, or perhaps restlessness, the sense that he was capable of more than the inherited shape of another man's farm. He had saved money for 3 years working for a freight company in Columbus, and when he had enough he had found a land agent and corresponded with him, and eventually settled on the Calhoun County property, because the price was right and the land was good, and Texas in 1873 was the kind of place that rewarded a man willing to work. He had been right about that, he said. The land had rewarded him. The cattle operation was modest but sound, and in a good year the returns were enough to build on, and he had been building steadily, adding to the herd in good years and holding tight in bad ones, and the property was better than it had been when he arrived by almost every measure. Rebecca asked questions. Not to fill the silence because the silence was gone now, but because she was genuinely interested, and because she found, as the evening deepened around them, that the man across the table was not the sealed and distant figure of the previous 6 nights but something far more interesting. A careful man, a thinking man, a man who had been made cautious by loss but who was not, underneath that caution, a small man in any sense. She told him things in return. About Nashville, about the boarding house where she had lived for the 2 years before coming west, about the work she'd done as a seamstress and sometimes as a schoolroom assistant, about the aunt who had raised her after her parents died, an aunt who was kind but practical in the way that people become practical when they have too many mouths to feed and not enough hands to earn. She told him about why she had answered the advertisement, which was not, she said, because she was desperate, though the situation had been uncomfortable. It was because when she read those plain, careful words she had thought, "This is a man who will not lie to me." And she had been tired, by that point in her life, of men who would. Isaac listened to all of this with his full attention, in a way that she realized she had not experienced very often, the particular quality of attention that makes a person feel that what they are saying matters and is being genuinely received rather than merely tolerated. At some point, without either of them marking the moment, the supper was long finished and the plates had been cleared and they were simply sitting at the table with their coffee, which had gone cold and been reheated twice, and talking. He asked about her cousin Clara and the new baby, which she had mentioned on the 5th night, and he had nodded at without response. Now he asked with real curiosity. What had she named him? Was Clara doing well? Was the father a good man? Rebecca laughed, and the laugh surprised her. It came out fuller than she'd intended, and she saw Isaac register it with a small shift in his expression, something that was not quite a smile yet but was the foundation of one. She told him about Clara's husband, a gentle-natured bookseller in Nashville named Edward, who was, by all accounts, alarmed by the baby but devoted to it, and Isaac said without apparent irony, "That sounds about right." And this time the foundation of a smile became actual, brief and quiet but real, and Rebecca felt something shift in the room between them, something that had been locked finding its latch. They talked about the cattle. She knew more about cattle than he'd expected, because the farm she'd grown up on outside Nashville before her parents died had kept a small herd, and she'd been old enough to absorb the practical knowledge before she was uprooted to the aunt's house in the city. Isaac asked her questions about what she'd observed since arriving, with the directness of a man who valued genuine information regardless of its source, and she answered with the same directness, mentioning that the calf he'd been doctoring seemed to be favoring its left front leg still, and that she'd seen what looked like foot rot in 2 of the cows on the south pasture. He went still again, but this time it was a different kind of still, the stillness of a person recalibrating. "You saw that," he said. "I've been walking the property in the mornings," she said. "I hope that's all right." "It's your property too," he said simply, and the simplicity of it went through her like a clean note on a fiddle string. Outside the window the darkness had changed. The frogs had quieted. The nighthawks had settled. The particular silence that falls in the hour before dawn, The silence that is not absence but full presence had descended on the house and the land around it. Rebecca became aware of it and looked at the window and calculated, from the quality of the light beginning to show at the edge of the hills, that it was close to 5 in the morning. They had been talking for nearly 7 hours. She looked back at Isaac and found him looking at her with an expression that she did not have full words for, but that she understood in the way you understand some things before language catches up with them. It was the expression of a man who has been somewhere very cold for a long time and has just, unexpectedly, found warmth. "I should," she began and stopped, because she didn't particularly want to end this, and she thought he probably felt the same. "The cattle won't wait much past 6, he said, not as a dismissal, but as an acknowledgement of the world outside the lamplight that would shortly require them. "No," she agreed. "They won't." They sat for another moment in the particular comfort of people who have said important things and do not need to fill the space afterward with more words. Then Isaac stood and took the coffee cups to the basin, and Rebecca folded the embroidered tablecloth carefully. And in the eastward window, the first thin line of light appeared on the hills her mother's cloth had been positioned to face. She went to her room and lay down for 2 hours before the day required her, and she did not sleep immediately but lay on her back looking at the ceiling with a feeling in her chest that was warm and complicated and not at all unwelcome. The following morning, Isaac came in for breakfast and sat down and looked at the plate she'd set in front of him and said, "I should have told you sooner. About Miriam. About all of it." Rebecca poured his coffee and sat across from him. "You told me when you were ready," she said. "Maybe I needed the right question," he said. "Maybe you did," she agreed. He looked up at her, and this time the almost smile was a real smile, small and careful but entirely genuine, and Rebecca felt it land somewhere in the center of her chest with a warmth that she recognized, without being fully prepared for it, as the first tender shoots of something that wanted very much to grow. The days after that were different in quality, not dramatically different. The work was the same work and the land was the same land, but there was an aliveness in the house now that had not been there before. It was present in the way they moved around each other in the kitchen, in the small exchanges over breakfast, in the way he would sometimes come to find her in the garden to tell her something he'd seen or decided, and in the way she had begun to walk the south pasture with him on evenings when the light was good, talking about the cattle and the land with the easy fluency of two people developing a shared language. He talked at supper now. Not at length, not with Miriam's gift for making every meal a celebration of the day, but with steadiness and honesty and an increasing ease that made Rebecca understand how thoroughly she had needed this, the actual conversation of an actual person who was engaged with the world and with her. He asked her about her plans for the garden, and she told him, and he said he would put up a proper fence around it to keep the deer out, and 3 days later the fence was there, built with the same careful competence he brought to every physical task. She mentioned, almost in passing, that she had always wanted to learn to ride properly. Back in Tennessee she had ridden a little but never well, and the Tennessee horse she had observed was a different animal from the Western working horse, and she had been watching Isaac ride with a covetousness she hadn't fully admitted to herself. He looked at her with those dark, attentive eyes and said, "Tomorrow morning before breakfast, I'll put you on Clover. She's got patience." Clover had patience. This was true, and Rebecca was grateful for it. That first morning she was stiff and uncertain, and Clover regarded her throughout with the philosophical calm of an animal that had been ridden by many nervous beginners and had made her peace with the human condition. Isaac stood at the fence and watched and gave short, clear instructions without condescension, and when Rebecca finally found the balance and the rhythm and let herself move with the horse instead of against it, the feeling was extraordinary, a kind of physical joy that she had not known was missing from her until she found it. She turned Clover in a wide circle and came back to the fence and looked down at Isaac, and he was looking up at her with an expression that was fully a smile now, Not the restrained, careful thing of the previous weeks, but something open and warm, and she felt the warmth of it land on her face like sunlight. "There it is," he said. "There it is," she agreed. They rode together after that on evenings when the work permitted it. He had a big dark bay horse named Shepherd, a name he had never satisfactorily explained, and the four of them, Rebecca and Clover and Isaac and Shepherd, made their way across the wide land of the Donnelly property in the late afternoon light, while the cattle grazed in the distance, and the hawks rode the thermals above the creek, and the mesquite trees threw their complicated shadows across the red earth. These rides became the part of the day Rebecca looked forward to most, not because they were the most useful or the most productive, but because they were the part of the day when she felt most fully alive and most fully in the company of another person who was also, she was beginning to believe, feeling something similar. He was not demonstrative. He was not a man who would reach for her hand at the fence post or say things that were designed to be romantic. But he was present in a way that mattered more than demonstration, attentive and consistent and increasingly, palpably glad of her company in a way that did not need to be announced. About 3 weeks after her arrival, the two of them were riding the eastern boundary of the property to check on a section of fence that Thomas Holt had mentioned was looking tired, and they came around a bend in the creek to find the late afternoon sun hitting the water at exactly the angle that turned it to gold, and the willows along the bank were just coming into their new leaves, that particular green that is only possible for about 10 days in early spring before it deepens. And Rebecca pulled Clover to a stop without thinking about it. Isaac stopped beside her. They sat their horses in silence for a moment, looking at the creek. "Miriam loved this spot," Isaac said. His voice was quiet and even, not torn open by it the way it would have been a month ago, but honest. "I can see why," Rebecca said. "So do I," he said. "I come out here in the evening sometimes. It's hard to be angry at a place that looks like this." She looked at him. "Were you angry, for a while," he said, "at everything that would keep existing without her, the creek and the hawks and the whole of it?" He paused. "Less so now." She understood what he meant by now, and she let it stand between them without requiring more from it. On the ride back he let Clover and Shepherd walk close together, closer than was strictly necessary, and at one point the horses' flanks touched and neither rider moved apart. May deepened into June, and June brought heat that was not Nashville heat, not the soft green humid heat she'd grown up in, but a dry, relentless brightness that pressed down on everything from a sky that was too large and too blue to fully comprehend. Rebecca adapted with the same deliberate practicality she brought to everything, rising earlier to work in the garden before the worst of it, wearing the wide-brimmed hat she'd bought in Indianola in her first week, drinking more water than she'd thought possible. Adeline Holt came by regularly and had become a genuine friend, the kind that is made quickly out of mutual respect and shared circumstance, and the particular loneliness of ranch women who needed the company of other women. She came one afternoon in late June to find Rebecca in the garden and said, with her characteristic directness, "You've done something to that man." Rebecca looked up from the beans she was tying. "I've done nothing to him." "You've gotten him talking again," Adeline said, settling herself on the fence rail with the ease of a woman who had no patience for formality. "Thomas mentioned it. Said Isaac came over last week and talked for an hour about the spring calving and the south pasture and some ideas he had about extending the herd, and Thomas said he hadn't heard the man talk like that in 3 years. Rebecca said nothing but felt something warm and private move through her. "I also notice," Adeline said, "that the two of you ride together every evening." "The fence checking takes 2 people," Rebecca said. "The fence checking," Adeline repeated, with a smile that contained an entire editorial. The incident that changed the pace of things happened on a Thursday in early July, and it was not dramatic in the Wild West sense. There was no gunplay or outlaw activity. It was the kind of incident that the land produces regularly, and that nevertheless has the power to rearrange the emotional furniture of people's lives. Rebecca had ridden out alone to the south pasture, because she had wanted to check on the 2 cows she'd identified earlier with what she'd suspected was foot rot, and Isaac was occupied with a buyer who had come to look at 3 steers. She had taken Clover and felt confident enough in her riding by now to go alone on the flat pasture land. She found the cows and confirmed that the foot rot was progressing and made note of it in her mind to tell Isaac when she got back. Then, on her way back, Clover startled at something in the tall grass and shied hard to the left, and Rebecca, who was a competent but not yet experienced rider, came off. She landed hard on her right side on the packed red earth and lay for a moment taking stock of herself, which was the sensible thing to do before attempting to move. Her right wrist ached sharply and her hip would bruise, but nothing was broken. The breath had gone out of her and she brought it back in carefully. Clover had not bolted. The horse stood about 10 feet away looking at her with an expression that Rebecca, even winded and sore, found faintly judgmental. "I know," she said. She got herself up and caught Clover's reins and stood for a moment until the world steadied, and then she got back on the horse with some difficulty and rode back to the house. Isaac was in the yard when she came in, the buyer's wagon having departed, and he saw her face before she'd said anything and crossed the yard at a pace that was faster than a walk without quite being a run. "What happened?" he said, reaching up to help her down before she'd asked. "I came off Clover," she said. "I'm fine, just banged up." His hands were on her arms as he helped her down, steadying her, and she felt them tighten briefly when she winced at the wrist. "Let me see it," he said. "It's not broken, it's just—" "Rebecca," he said. Just her name, but with a quality in it that stopped her argument entirely. She let him look at the wrist. He handled it with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the size of his hands, turning it carefully, testing the movement, and the concentration on his face was absolute and focused and deeply, disconcertingly kind. "Not broken," he confirmed, "but you should wrap it." He looked up at her then, and they were close, closer than they usually stood, and she could see the relief in his face as clearly as she'd ever seen any expression on it. And it was not the polite concern of a man for a useful household partner, but something more immediate than that. She looked back at him, and something settled between them that had been hovering for weeks. "Thank you," she said. He did not immediately move back, and neither did she. "There's a rattler out there," he said, his voice quiet. "In the south pasture. I'll go out and deal with it." "That's probably what spooked her," Rebecca said. "Probably," he said. He was still looking at her. "I should have told you about the south pasture. I knew there'd been one spotted." "Isaac," she said, "I'm not made of glass." "I know that," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, emphatic and certain, that made her understand he was not speaking only about this afternoon. He wrapped her wrist with strips of clean cloth from the medicine kit in the kitchen, and she sat on the table's edge while he did it, and they were close and quiet together, and outside the July sun lay bright and heavy on the yard, and the distant cattle were small dark shapes in the shimmering heat, and the whole world felt very still. When he tied off the wrap, his hands rested for just a moment on either side of her wrist, not holding, just resting, and she looked down at his hands and then up at his face, and he was looking at her with the full openness she had first seen that night at the table, the expression of a man who has put down a very heavy thing and discovered that his arms still work. "I'm glad you're here," he said. Not performed, not prepared. Just the truth, stated plainly in the way that he stated all true things. Rebecca felt the warmth of it move through her entire chest and settle somewhere that felt like it would stay warm for a long time. "So am I," she said. He let her rest for the afternoon, which she did not argue with because her hip was more bruised than she'd let on, and rest was genuinely warranted. He brought her supper in the sitting room instead of calling her to the table, which was not a thing she had expected from him, and which, accordingly, moved her more than a grander gesture might have. She told him about the foot rot on the south pasture cows, because she'd been out there to check on them, and she wasn't going to waste the information just because she'd also fallen off her horse. He listened carefully and said he'd have Thomas come over and help him treat them the next day, and that she'd been right to watch them, and that he'd noticed the same signs but had been hoping he was wrong. "You're not wrong often," he said. "About the cattle, I mean, the things you see." "I was raised on it," she said. "It comes back. There's a lot of knowledge people carry without knowing they carry it," he said thoughtfully, and she had the sense he was talking about more than cattle. Thomas Holt came over the next day, and he and Isaac worked the south pasture cows, and Adeline came with him and sat with Rebecca in the kitchen while she was still resting her wrist, and Adeline talked about everything under the sun in her warm, effortless way, and at one point she said, carefully but directly, "You're good for him, you know." Rebecca looked up from the beans she was shelling one-handed. "You brought him back," Adeline said. 3 years of watching that man shrink into himself, and now he's—" She made a gesture with her hand that was expressive enough not to require completion. "He brought himself back," Rebecca said. "I just asked a question." Adeline looked at her with sharp, warm eyes. "Honey, knowing which question to ask is the whole of it." The summer moved forward with the steady heat and beauty of a Texas summer, which is extraordinary and punishing in roughly equal measure. Rebecca's wrist healed and her riding improved, and the garden came into abundance that exceeded her plans. Tomatoes and peppers and beans and squash in quantities that required her to learn, quickly, a great deal about putting things up for winter, a project that occupied the kitchen for days at a time in a pleasant chaos of boiling jars and fragrant steam. Isaac was part of this project in a way that surprised her. He was not a man who would have described himself as interested in the kitchen, but he was a man who understood the logic of preservation, and he came in on the evenings of the putting-up days and helped with the lifting and the stacking with a matter-of-fact competence that blurred over time into something that looked very much like companionship. On one of those evenings, wrist-deep in tomatoes and surrounded by the hot, fragrant air of the kitchen in full production, Rebecca laughed at something he said, something dry and quiet about the arithmetic of tomatoes and winters, and he laughed too, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh, fully laugh, not the small almost smile she had won at breakfast, but actual laughter, warm and lower than his speaking voice, and it went through her like music. He seemed aware of it too, the rarity of it on his own lips. He looked at her with an expression that was wondering and warm, as if he was surprised by his own capacity for it, and she looked back at him flushed and beautiful from the heat of the kitchen and aware, with a certainty that was past the point of questioning, that she was falling in love with this man. That this was not what she had come here planning was irrelevant. It was happening regardless of her plans. She did not say any of this aloud. There was a natural pace to things, and she had enough sense to respect it. In August, a difficulty came in the form of a man named Luther Crane, who owned property 2 miles to the northwest, and who had been, according to Adeline, a thorn in the side of the small ranchers of Calhoun County for the better part of a decade. Crane was not a villain in any theatrical sense. He was simply a man with more money than principle, the kind who used the letter of property law to press on the margins of what was his and what was not, confident that smaller operations would lack the resources to fight him. He came to the Donnelly property on a hot August morning while Isaac was out on the East Range, and Rebecca answered the door. Crane was a florid man in his mid-50s, with the look of someone who ate too well and worked too little, wearing a good coat despite the heat, and carrying a manner of assumed authority that Rebecca recognized instantly from certain men she had known in Nashville, men who believed that their comfort was the most important thing in any room. He told her, pleasantly enough on the surface, that there was a matter of the creek boundary, that a section of the eastern creek bank, he had reason to believe, crossed his property line, and that the Donnelly fencing was accordingly wrong and would need to be moved. Rebecca asked him, with equal pleasantness, to show her the survey documents he was working from. Crane blinked. He had not expected this. She told him, still pleasantly, that her husband would be happy to discuss any boundary question with reference to the original survey documents, which she was sure Mr. Crane had, and that if there was indeed a discrepancy, they would of course want to resolve it correctly and according to the actual record. Crane left without his authority intact, and Rebecca went back to the kitchen feeling the sharp satisfaction of a well-placed word. When Isaac came in at noon and she told him about it, he listened with his full attention and then asked her, with something carefully restrained in his voice, what exactly she had said. She told him. He looked at her for a long moment. "He doesn't have a survey document," Isaac said. "I've had 3 from 2 different surveyors, and the boundary is exactly where the fence is. He's been making that claim to everyone on his west side for 5 years, but no one's ever asked him to produce the paper." "Well," Rebecca said, "someone has now." He looked at her with an expression that was admiration of the plainest and most genuine kind. "You're remarkable," he said, and it came out with a directness that told her he had not planned to say it. It had simply been the true thing, and it had come out. She felt the color rise in her face, which she had not expected, and was grateful for the cast-iron stove between them. "I grew up around men who thought the confidence of their voice was as good as documentation," she said. "I learned early that it isn't." "It generally isn't," he agreed. "We should write to the county surveyor anyway and request a certified copy of the current boundary record to have on file, just in case Crane decides to be persistent." "I'll write the letter this afternoon," she said. He nodded. "You don't need to. I know I don't need to," she said. "I want to." He was quiet for a moment then. "We make a good team." She looked at him and held his gaze and said, "Yes, we do." The letter was written and the certified copy arrived 3 weeks later, and when Crane made another approach in September, this time sending a hired man to speak to Isaac at the east fence, Isaac was able to produce the document on the spot, which ended the matter permanently. September came in cooler and the light changed, going from the flat white glare of summer to something amber and long and beautiful. The kind of light that makes everything look more significant than it already is. The cattle were fat from the summer grass, and the early planning for fall roundup had begun. And Isaac had begun talking to Rebecca about the possibility of adding to the herd next spring, if the winter was good, conversations that had the quality of genuine partnership, of 2 people thinking together about a shared future. One evening in late September, they were sitting on the porch after supper, which had become a habit of theirs in the cooler months, watching the stars come up one by one over the dark outline of the hills. The sky in Calhoun County was enormous, and it was full of stars in a way that city people could not quite imagine, more stars than sky, a depth of light that made you feel both very small and very present. Rebecca had her journal in her lap, but she was not writing in it. She was watching the stars and thinking about several things at once. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can always ask me something," he said. He was leaning back in the porch chair with his long legs stretched out, and he looked in the cool evening air more relaxed than she had ever seen him, the kind of ease that accumulates over months of feeling safe. "Are you happy?" she asked. "Not satisfied, not managing." "Happy?" He was quiet for a moment, but not the old heavy quiet. This was the quiet of honest consideration. "I think so," he said. "I'd forgotten what it felt like enough that it took me a while to recognize it." He looked at her. "Are you?" "Yes," she said without qualification. He looked at her for a long moment in the starlight, and then he reached across the space between their chairs and covered her hand with his, warm and large and certain. She turned her hand under his and held it. They sat like that for a long time in the star-filled night, not talking, not needing to, with the frogs singing down at the creek and the fire dying low in the house behind them, and all the wide land lying quiet around the small bright point of their porch. October brought the fall roundup, a substantial undertaking that required 3 additional hands and a week of hard work, and Rebecca was in the middle of all of it. She cooked for 5 men on the days the extra hands were present, a logistical challenge she met with the same methodical competence she'd applied to every challenge. And she rode out with Isaac on the long sorting days, useful and capable and increasingly sure on horseback. Thomas Holt brought his son Eli to help, a young man of 19 who was good with cattle and respectful, and impressed by Rebecca's riding, in a way he was transparent enough to mention, which made Isaac look at him with an expression that was more possessive than he probably realized, and which Rebecca tucked away privately to think about later. One night during the roundup week, after the extra hands had gone to their bedrolls in the barn, and the house was quiet and she and Isaac were in the kitchen, her washing up and him reviewing the tally book with a lamp pulled close, she came to stand beside him to look at the numbers. He moved over on the bench without being asked, making room for her, and she sat beside him and leaned over the tally book with him, and their heads were close together and his arm was against hers, and neither of them acknowledged it and both of them were aware of it completely. "The numbers look good," she said. "Better than last year," he agreed. "If we sell 60 head in the spring at current prices, we'll have enough to clear the cost of the new fence and still buy 20 additional breeding cattle." "What about the south pasture well?" she said. "The water's been low." He looked at her. "You've been watching the south pasture well." "I've been watching everything," she said. He smiled, that real smile that still affected her the same way it had the first time it had fully appeared. "The well should be dealt with before spring," he said. "I was going to have Eli's father look at it. Thomas is good with wells." "Good," she said. They were still sitting very close together, shoulder to shoulder over the tally book, and the lamp threw its warm circle around them, and outside the October night was cool and full of stars, and from the barn the horses shifted and settled in their stalls. Isaac looked up from the tally book and his face was very close to hers, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other in the lamplight. "Rebecca," he said, and his voice had the quality it got when he was saying something that mattered. "Yes," she said. "I should tell you something. Tell me." He looked at her with those dark, honest eyes. "I started to love you," he said, "around the time of the tomatoes." She felt the warmth of it fill her entirely and without complication, clean and clear and certain. "The tomatoes," she said. "When you laughed," he said, "and I laughed, and I had thought for a long time that I was finished with that." She reached up and put her hand against his jaw, his scarred jaw, the one she had been looking at for 5 months and thinking about longer than she'd admitted to herself. And he went very still in the particular way he went still when something moved him, and she said, "You are not finished with anything, Isaac Donnelly." He turned his face into her hand for just a moment, closing his eyes, and then he turned back and kissed her, which he did with the same care and intention he brought to everything he valued, and she kissed him back with all the warmth that had been accumulating in her for 5 months looking for a way out. When they stopped, he pressed his forehead to hers and they sat like that in the lamplight, and she felt the rise and fall of his breathing and the solid warmth of him and the extraordinary rightness of being exactly where she was. "I love you," she said, plainly, the way true things should be said. "I love you," he said, the same plain certainty, as if it were an answer to a question that had been posed a long time ago and had finally, at the right moment, received the correct response. Outside, the October wind moved through the grass of the wide Texas night, and inside the warm house the lamp burned steady and true. They talked until nearly 2 in the morning that night, not about cattle and property and practical matters, but about everything else, all the things they had not yet told each other, his fear that he had been too closed for too long to be worth opening, her fear that she had come too far from everything she knew to build something real, the particular ways their losses had shaped them, and the ways they had learned, each separately and now together, to carry those losses without letting them be the whole of the weight. He told her about the last letter Miriam had written him, from Indianola, before she died. She had written it the week she knew she was expecting, before things went wrong, and the letter was full of her characteristic laughter and wonder, and it had been the hardest and most precious thing in his possession for 3 years. He told Rebecca about it not as a wound but as a gift he was choosing to share, and she understood the difference and received it accordingly. She told him about her parents, about the summer fever that had taken them both when she was 11, about the particular brutality of an illness that took two people in the space of a week, and left a child in the care of a kind but already stretched woman who did her best, but who could not replace what was lost. She had not told many people this story, not because she was ashamed of it, but because most people became uncomfortable with grief and either overresponded or retreated, and Isaac Donnelly did neither. He listened with complete attention, and then he took her hand and held it and said, "You've been building your own home since you were 11 years old." And the precision of it, the way it named exactly what she had been doing without making it into either tragedy or triumph, made her eyes sting. "Yes," she said, "I suppose I have." "Well," he said, looking at her steadily, "this one is yours now, as much as it's mine." He had not asked her to marry him in any formal sense. That had been handled with the practical correspondence of the spring. But this statement in the lamplight over the tally book with his hand holding hers, this felt like the real thing, the true contract, the one written in the actual material of their lives rather than in ink on paper. November brought the rains back and the cattle grew their winter coats and the garden was put to bed under the first frost, its beds turned and composted for spring. Rebecca found, in a chest in her room that she hadn't fully unpacked because it had been pushed to the back and held things from Nashville she had not yet sorted through, the materials for a quilt her mother had started before she died, cut fabric pieces still bundled together with a length of cord, faded to a soft blue-gray but still clearly what they were. She brought them to Isaac and showed him, not because she needed his permission but because she was a person who shared things now, who had a person to share things with, and she told him what they were and where they came from. He looked at the fabric pieces with careful attention. "Are you going to finish it?" he said. "I'm going to try," she said. "Your mother cut those pieces," he said. "Yes." He looked at her and then at the fabric. "It'll be worth something when you're done," he said. "Not in money, in the other kind." She quilted through the winter evenings, sitting by the fire while Isaac read or worked his account books, or, on the evenings when neither of them had the energy for anything else, simply sat near her in the firelight. And the house was warm and quiet and full of the particular contentment of two people who have chosen each other well. They married properly in December, in a small ceremony in the Indianola church with Adeline and Thomas Holt as witnesses, and the minister who served several ranching families in the county presiding, a short spare man who had married many couples out here on the edge of the known world, and who said his words with the gravity they deserved. Rebecca wore a dress of deep green wool she had made herself, with the most precise stitching she could manage, and she carried a small bunch of dried wildflowers because nothing fresh bloomed in December, but she wanted flowers anyway. Isaac stood beside her in his good coat and looked at her with everything visible on his face, everything he had said and everything he had not yet needed to say. And when the minister asked him if he took this woman, he said, "I do," with the plain, certain weight of a man who means every syllable of a thing. The ceremony was followed by supper at the Holt house with a small group of neighbors, and there was music because Thomas played fiddle, and there was dancing in the cleared parlor, and Isaac danced with Rebecca with the methodical determination of a man who was not a natural dancer but who had decided to be one, and she pressed her face against his shoulder to hide her laughter, and he felt it and said quietly in her ear, "I know I'm terrible at this," and she said, "You're not terrible at anything that matters." And he held her a little tighter, and they danced badly and happily until the fire burned low. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was cold but not catastrophically so, the kind of winter that tested a ranching operation without destroying it, and they got through it with most of the herd intact, and the house tight and warm, and the two of them moving through the days and nights with the growing ease and warmth of people who are daily becoming more themselves in each other's company. In January, Rebecca wrote to her cousin Clara in Nashville and told her everything, the whole story of the 6 silent suppers and the 7th night's question, and the tomatoes and the roundup and the October lamplight and the December church. And Clara wrote back a letter of 6 pages full of exclamation points and questions that made Rebecca laugh so hard at the kitchen table that Isaac came in from the barn to see what had happened. "My cousin Clara," Rebecca said, showing him the letter. He read it with a growing smile. "She uses a great many exclamation points," he observed. "She's enthusiastic," Rebecca said. "Clearly," he said, and handed the letter back, and kissed her on the top of her head as he passed, which was a thing he did now, casually and with complete naturalness, that she had not anticipated, and that she loved without reservation. Spring came back around, as it does, with the particular generosity of a Texas spring after a cold winter, everything blooming at once as if trying to make up for lost time. The garden Rebecca planted that second spring was twice the size of the first year's attempt, ambitious, and planned with the confidence of someone who now knew the soil and the light, and the particular temperament of the land she was working. She was by that point aware that the coming autumn would likely see the family grow by one. She told Isaac on a warm April evening, sitting on the porch with the first fireflies of the season blinking in the pasture grass, doing it with the directness she brought to everything important. She said, "I believe we're going to have a child in October or thereabouts," and she watched his face. He went very still. Not the sealed, heavy still of the early weeks, but a different stillness. The stillness of a man receiving something enormous and trying to hold it correctly. Then he reached for her hand and held it with both of his and looked at her with an expression that was the sum of everything she had come to know about him. All his care and his seriousness and his love and his long-held grief and his equally genuine gladness, all of it present at once. "Are you well?" he said. "First, before anything else, that question." "I am very well," she said, "strong and healthy and entirely not worried." "Are you sure?" He said, and she heard in it everything he was not saying, the memory of another spring, another hope, another outcome. She turned to face him fully and held his gaze with the steadiness she always brought when he needed it most. "I am not Miriam," she said, gently but without apology, "and this is not 1875, and I will not let you spend the next 6 months inside your fear when you could spend them here with me present, which is where I need you." He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched the fear and the love work through each other on his face like weather. "All right," he said, and he meant it. All right. He was present. He was more present than she had known him to be at any point before, which was saying something, because he had always been a present man. He accompanied her to the doctor in Indianola twice, sitting in the waiting room with his hat in his hands and his jaw set with the careful tension of controlled fear. And on both occasions, the doctor pronounced everything entirely normal, and on both occasions, Isaac walked out of the doctor's office and visibly let himself breathe. He finished the cradle he had been building in the evenings through the summer, working on it by lamplight in the barn after supper, with the focused care of a man building something that needed to be right. He had not shown it to Rebecca while he was building it, and when he brought it in on a cool October morning and set it in the corner of their room, it was beautiful in the plain, purposeful way that well-made things are beautiful, solid wood joined with perfect joints and sanded smooth, and fitted with a small hood that curved over the top. She stood looking at it with her hands folded over the considerable evidence of October and said, "Isaac, don't say anything about it," he said. "I'm going to say it was made by an extraordinary person," she said. He looked uncomfortable in the specific way of a man who does not know what to do with sincere admiration, and she loved him intensely for it. Their son was born in October, a week past the date she had estimated, on a clear cold night with the stars very bright over Calhoun County. The doctor came from Indianola as arranged, and Adeline was there, and Isaac was there in the hall, which was close enough to be present and far enough away that the doctor could work without managing a worried husband. Rebecca labored with the focused determination she brought to everything difficult, and by midnight it was done. And the child that was placed in her arms was red-faced and entirely loud about his arrival and perfect in every way. and she lay back against the pillow and held him and felt the particular wholeness that comes from something being complete. Isaac came in when Adeline called him, and he stood in the doorway for a moment looking at Rebecca, and the child with an expression that Rebecca would remember for the rest of her life, because it was the face of a man who has been given back something he did not expect to receive again. Not the same thing he lost, never that, but something of equal and particular value. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the child in his arms, and he held his son for the first time with the same careful, deliberate competence he brought to all things that mattered. And Rebecca watched his face do everything it was capable of doing, and then he looked up at her, and she saw that his eyes were bright. "What do we call him?" she said. He had already told her his preferences, and she had told him hers, and they had agreed, as they agreed on most things, through honest exchange and mutual respect. "Thomas," he said. "Thomas Daniel Donnelly," for Thomas Holt, who had told him to start living again. For his brother Daniel in Ohio, who had written a long, warm letter when told about Rebecca, and who had said, with the plain directness of a Donnelly, that he was glad his brother had found someone worth talking to. "Thomas Daniel Donnelly," Rebecca said. "That's a good name for a serious person." The child seemed, even then, to be exactly that kind of person. He regarded the world with dark, solemn eyes from the first days, absorbing information with the steady focus of someone taking notes, and Rebecca thought, watching him, that he had his father's way of being in a room, present, observant, not easily disturbed. He was not a quiet child. He made his needs known with great thoroughness and volume, which was a different thing from quietness, and which delighted Adeline Holt to no end when she came over to see him, and declared him the most opinionated-looking infant she had ever encountered. Isaac, who had been afraid of this, was not afraid of it once it was here. He held his son with an ease that surprised even himself, and he talked to the child, which was perhaps the most unexpected thing, talked to him quietly and at length about the cattle and the property and the hills visible from the window, and the way the creek ran after a good rain, as if beginning the long education of someone who would one day need to know all of it. Rebecca watched this from the doorway one evening and felt something move through her that was too large for one word, something that was love and gratitude and awe and the particular satisfaction of something built correctly from the ground up. The years that followed moved with the rhythm of the land, which is not slow or fast but steady, governed by seasons and rains and the needs of living things rather than by clocks or appointments. The Donnelly property grew, carefully and with deliberate planning, the herd expanding and the house itself eventually gaining 2 additional rooms that Isaac and Thomas Holt built together in the summer of 1881. Because the first addition Rebecca and Isaac had found themselves discussing was necessary not just for comfort, but because Thomas Daniel had a sister now. Margaret Rose Donnelly arrived in the summer of 1881, considerably less impressed by her own arrival than her brother had been, coming into the world with a calm, almost philosophical expression that she maintained for the rest of her infancy, as if she had assessed the situation and found it acceptable. She was a serene baby and a determined toddler, and from the time she could walk she went after whatever she wanted with a directness that Isaac observed one afternoon, watching his daughter cross the yard with absolute purpose towards something she had decided to investigate, and said, "She gets that from you." "She gets it from both of us," Rebecca said. "The fearlessness is yours," he said. "The determination is yours," she replied. He considered this with the careful fairness he brought to all assessments and said, "All right, fair." Thomas wrote from Ohio in 1882 to say that he was coming west to see his brother and this family he had heard so much about, a visit that took 3 weeks and that enriched both households considerably. Thomas Donnelly was a broader, louder version of his brother, with the same dark eyes but an entirely different relationship to silence, talking cheerfully through every meal about everything from Ohio politics to cattle prices to the state of the railways. And Isaac sat across from him at the table and smiled into his coffee in the particular way of a man who loves someone deeply and knows them completely. Thomas told Rebecca in a private moment when Isaac was out in the barn that he had been worried about his brother for years, and that meeting her had ended that worry with the completeness of a door closing. He was not lost, Rebecca said. He just needed to find his way back on his own terms. Thomas looked at her with his brother's eyes. And you helped him. We helped each other, she said. She meant it entirely. In the evenings, after the children were in bed and the day's work was done, they still sat on the porch sometimes, she and Isaac, watching the stars come up over the dark hills. The stars had not changed. The land around them had their marks on it now in ways both visible and invisible. The fences and the garden and the extended house, and the graves of animals they had cared for, and the invisible marks of years of decisions made together and trust built slowly and love grown large enough to hold everything it needed to hold. On one such evening in the autumn of 1883, 5 years after Rebecca had stepped off the wagon into a lightning-split Texas night and looked at a tall, quiet man who would not speak at supper, she sat beside that man on the porch with her head against his shoulder and his arm around her, and the warm weight of a good life surrounding them on all sides. "You know what I've been thinking about," she said. "Tell me," he said. "That 7th night," she said, "when I asked you what had happened to you." He was quiet for a moment. "What about it?" "I've been thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't asked," she said. "Or if I'd asked something different, or if I'd asked it on the wrong night." He considered this with his characteristic thoroughness. "You asked because you'd been watching me for 6 nights and you decided you understood something about me," he said. "That I wasn't quiet because I had nothing to say. You were right, that's why it worked." "You could have refused to answer," she said. "I could have," he agreed. "But I didn't want to. I'd been carrying it alone long enough." He paused. "I think I was waiting for someone worth the weight of it." She lifted her head and looked at him in the porch dark, his familiar face, the lines that the years and the sun had deepened, and that she had traced with her fingers enough times to know them as well as her own. And she thought of the advertisement folded in her coat pocket on a rainy night 5 years ago. The plain, honest words of a man who measured everything before committing it to paper. And she thought of a table set for 2 in a fire-lit room, and the weight of 6 silent suppers. And the right question asked on the 7th night, and how from that one question everything else had unfurled like a country scene from high ground, vast and particular and entirely, beautifully real. "Isaac," she said. "Rebecca," he said. The stars came up over the hills. The cattle settled in the south pasture. Inside the warm house, Thomas Daniel and Margaret Rose slept in their rooms, dreaming the deep dreams of children who have never known a night when the house was not safe and warm and full of the accumulated presence of 2 people who had chosen each other well and kept on choosing. Isaac pulled her close and she leaned into him, and they sat together in the enormous Texas night, and the creek ran silver over its stones in the dark, and the land they had built a life on lay wide and breathing around them, and there was nothing left unfinished, nothing left unsaid, nothing missing from the whole of it. Just the stars and the 2 of them and the long, luminous, fully inhabited life they had made.